I am Hannah Riley Bowles. I have the honor of co-directing the Women in Public Policy program here at the Harvard Kennedy School with Professor Iris Bonet. Welcome to our fall WAP research seminar series on exploring work and family. So this series has been organized to explore research related to managing the boundaries of work and family, illuminating how individual agency, institutions, policies, and social norms shape our ability to thrive in both of these realms. Today, we are delighted to welcome Professor Thébaud. She is the professor of sociology, director of the Work and Family Innovation Lab at the Broome Center for Demography, and faculty affiliate of technology management at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her research identifies social, psychological, and institutional processes that contribute to gender inequalities at work, within families, in higher education, and in entrepreneurship. Professor Thébaud will discuss how couples often end up with gendered divisions of labor, even when they prefer equality and when they experience myriad advantages like access to supportive work-family policies and ample financial resources. So this is the group we'd most think it would work out for, and we're going to have an opportunity to explore what enables them and what gets in their way. So our speaker is going to present for 50 minutes. That said, she welcomes clarifying questions in the chat. So I'll keep an eye on the chat and we can surface those if helpful as we go along. But more broadly, put your questions in the chat, or as we get to the Q&A session after the presentation, we'll look for your virtual hand. And hopefully, if it's possible for you to join us in person and ask your question with your camera on, that's terrific. If it's better that we read out your question, we can do that too. So please join me in welcoming Sarah to present today. Over to you.
Great. Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much for this invitation. It's really such an amazing series of speakers that you've put together, many of whom's work I look up to and have esteemed for many years, including your work. So thank you so much. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to your feedback. And as Professor Riley Bowles just mentioned, any clarifying questions, please don't hesitate to jump in and slow me down. Okay, so I will just jump right into it then. Okay, so for decades, social scientists have been studying the gender division of labor in families. Even though we've seen many fluctuations in terms of the number of hours people devote to housework and childcare, and men have definitely increased the amount of hours that they contribute, women continue to shoulder the burden of household and caregiving responsibilities. So what's striking is that this gender division of labor persisted despite large-scale changes in women's educational, occupational, and labor market status. So, for instance, a recent study found that in heterosexual partnerships, women still take on relatively more domestic labor, both in terms of childcare and housework, even when they're employed full-time and when they're bringing home as much income, if not more, of the family income than their spouse. So this graphic, it's from the Pew Research Center. It depicts this pattern pretty clearly. So here they show the statistics only for couples where each partner brings in about half of the income, so 40 to 60%. And as you can see, even in these cases, women are spending like about 5 hours more per week on caregiving and housework than men. Okay, so why should we really care about this? Well, so research has shown that gender inequality basically in the household is really one of the major drivers of gender inequality in society more broadly. So in terms of leadership and in terms of just the status of women in society, broadly speaking. Now, this argument actually makes a lot of sense when you think about the fact that the most highly paid and most highly influential jobs in our economy require and increasingly reward, there's an extra pay premium on very long hours and also on the extensive travel and face time that these kinds of jobs require. These expectations are really hard to meet if you have any sort of family responsibilities. Now, research also shows, though, that individual commitment to equality isn't actually enough to change things. So even when couples prefer to share things more equally, they often struggle to do so. So workplace and other constraints often end up kind of motivating them to in the long term, fall back onto arrangements that end up prioritizing men's work and prioritizing men's paid work, I should say, and women's unpaid work. So professionals, these kinds of constraints, like I mentioned, they kind of include long hours, expectations to always be on call. Now, for middle and working class parents, though, these parents also sometimes deal with those long hours expectations, but they also deal with irregular and unpredictable work hours, and also, unpredictable pay and lower pay, of course. So you pair those issues with inadequate paid leave, poorly timed school schedules, expensive childcare systems, and in many cases, workplace norms that stigmatize workers who are caregivers or who use work family policies. In those situations, you kind of end up with situations where it's just really difficult for two employed partners to figure out how to split things evenly. So this brings me to the main puzzle, which is if anybody's going to actually figure out how to do this, what kinds of people might those be, and under what conditions are they most likely to be successful? Now, I know I just rattled off like a very long laundry list, and I know you all have heard about some of these things in this series already, but there's a lot of things that make it hard to succeed at sharing unpaid work. But professionals generally have a lot of advantages, right? They make much more money. They have more savings. They have also greater access to favorable working conditions, like access to work family policies, like paid leave and flex time, etc. If anything, many companies seem to kind of bend over backwards to try to appease more of the professional workers than the non-professional workers, which is a huge problem, which I could give a whole separate talk about, but that one's not for today. But so we would also assume, though, that folks who hold more traditional viewpoints about gender would also end up, of course, being less committed maybe to sharing those responsibilities. So we kind of wanted to know, so even when people have the privileges and they express a desire for equality, why don't they seem to achieve it? So what are the mechanisms that are kind of acting as the ultimate barriers here? So it's sort of like a glass ceiling, if you want to think of it that way, as it pertains to the question of the gender division of labor. Okay, so now just real briefly, most of the existing research on the gender division of labor in families has really focused on individual or couple level explanations. And a lot of this is in the demographic research. So we know, for instance, gender ideologies matter a lot at the individual level. And then a lot of research has shown how people's time use and also their relative and absolute income levels of income affect their household labor. Um, in addition to this, and I should say economists have done a lot of this work as well, sociologists have also theorized the home as a gender factory where our culturally shared, taken for granted cultural expectations about what kinds of people should be doing care, men, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and how that kind of plays out in interesting ways in families, especially when it comes to caregiving and how that shapes people's decisions and time use. So for instance, cultural stereotypes about men and women tend to describe men as better suited for work outside the home, especially time-intensive careers, and women is better suited for caregiving. I mean, a critically important thing to distinguish, though, here about this argument is that, people do not need to agree explicitly with these cultural ideas or expectations kind of floating around out there in order to be influenced by them. So even if they hold, beliefs that the division of labor should be split equally, like the couples in our sample do, and if they disagree with the essential stereotypes that, men can't change a diaper or something like that, or that women can't bring home all of the income. Even if they disagree with those ideas, they might still end up subtly defaulting, I should say, to gendered practices simply because they kind of know that many other people, including their employers, might hold them accountable to these kinds of expectations. Now, a similar but growing body of research has looked at organizational policies and their effects on the division of labor. And these have focused on how workplace policies and norms can actually facilitate or inhibit workers from being able to manage work and family responsibilities. So, for instance, we know that paid leave in particular has really positive causal effects on the division of labor. And that's especially when men take more paid leave. Those studies are really fascinating. So anyway, in this paper, what we're trying to do is introduce a new approach, thanks in part because we have a really rich data set, which I'll get to in a minute. We're able to theorize and assess how individual, family, and organizational dynamics actually mutually matter. And so by doing this, we're able to kind of introduce a systems level perspective that goes beyond the way that other studies typically think about this, because other studies typically look at like a single organization and workers in that organization, but they can't look at all the individual dynamics or vice versa. So this is kind of a summary of what I just mentioned. So for each of these broad levels of analysis, we theorize and test a series of factors that we're able to measure and that we believe matter, even after we account for all of these factors that are happening at the other levels of analysis. Okay, so starting at the organizational level, empirically here, we measure the influence of paid leave taken by both our own respondents and their partners. We also look at the use of flexible work arrangements, so whether people use flex time policies or flex place policies, so meaning like flex time is you can have some sort of autonomy over your start and stop times, flex place being like you work remotely at least for part of the time. I don't have time to walk you. We actually have a lot of hypotheses here, so I'm not going to bore you by walking you through every single hypothesis. But I do want to highlight a couple of critical things. Okay, so the first here is the relevance of spousal paid leave for women in the sample. So we're focused on a sample of people who all took paid leave in their organizations after the birth of a child. So we don't actually have much variability in terms of the respondents' policy use. But what's important is how the experiences of these workers are shaped by the wider organizational environment. So in most cases, the spouses of our respondents work full-time at other organizations. These organizations are statistically unlikely to offer leave policies, especially to men, that are as generous as those in our sample. In particular, the husbands of the women in our sample were very interested in seeing um, how the effects of their leave, because there's a wide variability in terms of how much leave those men took. So let's see, the second thing I want to point out too here is that a major factor that's been the topic of a lot of research, both qualitative and quantitative, is the concept of the ideal worker norm in organizations. This idea is basically the consensus that the best workers tend to be the ones who are wholly committed to their jobs above all else and have near constant availability to their employer. So this system of norms and rewards structures basically implicitly assumes that workers shouldn't have any like caregiving responsibilities, no distractions. They should be able to be on call and ready to jump into the project. Those are the workers that get promoted, that get lauded, etc. And research has also been accumulating that that kind of norm also stigmatizes then workers who break the norm, of course. So like if you say, I'm going to take, parental leave or I'm going to take paternity leave for 3 months, that really might signal, oh, maybe that person's not quite so committed to their job. Now, of course, in reality, the extent to which people experience and perceive these norms varies a lot across workplaces. And so what's cool about our study is that we can actually independently measure people's perceptions about ideal worker norms in their own workplace rather than kind of inferring the presence of that norm by looking at, say, how many hours they work or whether they use policies. Okay,
Sarah,
now,
there's a quick
yes.
question in the chat, which
Oh,
I think you
great.
just answered, but I want to
Okay.
confirm.
Sure.
Doris is asking, is the organizational norms a variable on the employer level, industry level, or even broader? So could you just, I think you just answered
Hmm.
this question and maybe just clarified it again.
Sure. I will go through I'll review this in the data part as well. But yes, just to clarify, we measure it as the respondents' perceptions of the norms that they're held to in their own workplace. Um, so it's measured at the individual level, but it is a perception about the organizational level context. I'll specify too exactly how we measure that, so hopefully that'll get clearer. But yes, conceptually, the norms can operate at all of the levels. Um, okay, because there's differences between somebody might perceive the norm to be stronger than other people perceive it, right? So, good question. Okay, so now moving on to the work and family dynamics. So as I mentioned, at the family level, a really large and old literature has established that, for instance, bargaining dynamics matter in terms of how much relative income is predictive of, when women earn more income, they tend to have a more egalitarian division of labor, for instance. Um, and now here we also assess how much their spouses overwork. So how much the own respondent and the spouses overwork. And here, consistent with other literature, we define overwork as working more than 50 hours per week. Um, and an additional, the other thing that's cool is we actually are able to measure the form of childcare that these couples rely on as well. So here we have a variable for whether somebody relies on extended family as for routine care, so like grandparents, in most cases, or do they rely more on formal care, so childcare centers, nannies, paid care, etc. And here we do a bit of theorizing about, we think that relying on family for routine care will reduce the likelihood of equality. And we have two reasons for that. So first, extended family, like grandparents, might be less reliable, right? So if they get ill or something, um, who's the backup, right? And so in cases where there's a need for backup care, we know from other research that mothers often are the ones who tend to fill in the gaps when there is a need for backup care. The other thing we're thinking potentially is that parents, on average, we know are at least somewhat less progressive than their children. And so while parents are indeed being supportive in these cases, they're supporting their children and their dual careers. There is also a higher frequency of interactions, and that may increase exposure to gendered caregiving expectations in very subtle ways. Or maybe not so subtle, I don't know. And we think that mothers might be especially likely to feel that, the mother-in-law or the mother may be kind of more present and making her feel like, oh, I better, pick up the extra caregiving. Okay, and then finally, individual characteristics, we also control for things that we know matter from socialization processes and also individual level traits. So like socialization accounts, for instance, argue that that through repetitious social interactions, girls and women learn that they're expected to be warm and communal, whereas boys and men learn that they're expected to be agentic. But of course, really importantly, a lot of people internalize those ideas to widely varying degrees. So here we kind of capture some of that with three variables. So first, we assess whether they're mother was their primary caregiver in the household they grew up in. The idea here is that since we know that role modeling and implicit expectations can be produced and reinforced in the beginning of childhood. So, and then we also assess two aspects of personality, whether the respondent sees themselves as someone who is willing to defend their own beliefs. So here, so stepping back for a minute, we know from qualitative research that when couples actively discuss and negotiate things about, well, who's going to pick up this caregiving or whatever, when there's an active conversation about, oh, I don't feel like you're doing enough, or can you do that? That tends to lead to more egalitarian outcomes. And so here we're theorizing that people who see themselves as like the type of person who's going to really defend what they care about, that those people might be especially more likely to negotiate for these egalitarian arrangements. And then finally, warmth. We theorized as well that men who see themselves as, warm, caring, gentle, etc., may see themselves also as more fit for caregiving and also might be more willing to step up. Okay, so our data, we have a really cool original data set that was collected in 2019 by the Boston College Center for Work and Family. And it's based on four large global firms. These are three elite professional services firms and one consumer goods firm. And we have a lot of information, as I mentioned, about both the respondents and their spouses. And I should also mention all four organizations offered fully paid parental leave to both mothers and fathers, ranging between 6 and 16 weeks, which by industry standards is very generous for that time, especially. Um, and then all survey respondents are parents who took the leave within the previous year or so. 2 years actually, sorry. Um, they also state that their ideal preference is to share caregiving equally. We ask them, how would you ideally like to divide household responsibilities? And so everyone here agreed that they wanted to share things evenly. They're all professional workers with a BA or a post-BA degree, and they all have spouses that work full-time. And so our total sample, we had a lot more mothers than we had fathers. There's a lot of reasons for that, which I can talk about in the Q&A, but it's not that surprising because for a lot of reasons. But it also means we have a very select group of both men and women who are very committed to this. Okay, our analysis focuses, our main dependent variable is we're predicting, they're asked, how do you divide, they're asked like, how would you like to divide things? And then how do you divide things? And so, the dependent variable is do you share things equally? If they say they roughly share caregiving equally with their spouse. And then if they don't, it means that the female partner is taking on more. So we have logistic regression models predicting this outcome. We do a series, because we have all these levels of analysis going on, we do a series of stepwise models that separately assesses the organizational, family, and individual level factors. And then we also do separate analyses for mothers and fathers. Spoiler alert, very few of the effects change actually across all the models. So we have a final model where we put everything in, and that's what I'm going to show you the majority of the results with like one exception. But for the most part, there's not a whole lot in terms of everything's kind of significant across models, even when we adjust for all this stuff going on at the other levels. Okay, and then we have controls for standard things. We also, and I can talk about this if there's enough time, we also do a supplemental analysis to look at the likelihood of egalitarian division of housework. So the respondents were asked both, like, how do you want to ideally share housework and how do you share housework? And so we have some differences in results for that. Okay, so because we have a lot of findings, I'm going to kind of give you a preview here of some of the major takeaways, and then I'll walk you through some of the patterns. So uh, for the organizational norms and policies um, set of variables, we know that we show that there's a really strong effect of for the mothers who had partners, again, who are working in other organizations, if those partners were able to take longer paternity leave, it really increased their probability of achieving this egalitarian division of care. Same thing with mothers actually who worked on site. So another way of saying this is that mothers who took advantage of flex place policies, they were actually less likely to have an egalitarian division of care. Also, this independent measure of perceptions of ideal worker norms were very negative for men. So the more that men felt that they were experiencing these kinds of pressures, the less likely they were to have an egalitarian division of care. Then moving on to the work and family dynamics, so that we also have very strong patterns where when in couples where the man is working less than 50 hours per week, regardless of how much whether the female partner is working overworking, all of those situations really reduces the odds of equality. Um, Also, when the female partner has a higher job status and relative income, consistent with other literature, we do see evidence of bargaining. That's reassuring. We would think that if we see bargaining, you would think you would see it in this kind of sample. And then we also find that relying on formal childcare does help rather than family does help, especially mothers achieve this egalitarian outcome. And then finally, uh, for the individual background, for both the mother and the father's sample, um, whether or not they had grown up in a family where their mother was the primary caregiver, in those families, they were much less likely to achieve equality. So not having, having been raised by parents that shared things evenly, the people who kind of grew up in that situation, they were much more likely to do that themselves. It's another way of thinking of that. And then finally, whether they felt that they defend their own beliefs, that really matters for mothers. Okay, so what does this actually look like? Okay, so for organizational factors, here we can see on the y-axis is the probability of achieving egalitarian division of care. On the x-axis are weeks of leave that the father, so the partner of the mothers in our sample, basically these people in other organizations, as I mentioned, there's quite a bit of variability in the amount of leave they took. So when they have partners that take longer leaves, they're more likely to have equal caregiving arrangements. So specifically, like for women who have spouses that didn't take leave, they're predicted to have only about a 50% chance of equality. And this is net of all this other stuff going on. But those who have spouses that actually took several weeks of leave are predicted to get up to close to an 80% chance of equality. Okay. As I mentioned, we also find that working on site compared to working remotely is associated with more equal caregiving, especially among mothers. And this was actually something that we had expected, just the flexibility is complicated. It can be a double-edged sword for women. So even though flexibility and it improves the ability to manage work and family demands, remote work in particular also seems to increase women's physical availability as the sort of go-to or default caregiver. And this, we observed this a lot during the COVID crisis. But importantly, we do not find any significant effects for the flex time variable. So that start and stop times variable that I mentioned, that actually was not related to the division of labor. So there seems to be something specific about the physical availability that working from home, it kind of does seem to reinforce women's responsibility for caregiving. And that is consistent with some other studies, especially recent ones coming out. Okay, now it's fascinating that what mattered at the organizational level for our sample of fathers was really different than from the mothers. For them, we didn't find significant effects for the policy use variables. I think a lot of that has to do with the selection of men into the sample, and I can talk a lot about that in the Q&A as well. It has to do with the fact that they all kind of took a lot of leave and and also their partners take a lot of leave, even if it's unpaid. So anyway, but here the punchline is really about the organizational culture. So as I mentioned, we directly measured ideal worker norm perceptions. So specifically here, we created an index that's the mean of responses to 5 items. And these were each rated, measured on a 5-point Likert scale. So 3 items reflected overall perceptions of their workplace culture. So for instance, agreement with the statement, it is assumed that the most productive employees are those who prioritize work over personal life. So it's like in my organization, do I agree that this is true? Strongly agree, strongly disagree. Then, so there were 3 statements kind of along those lines, and then 2 additional items also indicated information about managerial support for, or lack thereof, for work-family policy use. So we reverse coded items, responses to the questions. For instance, my manager is supportive of employees using flexible work arrangements, and how supportive was your manager of your decision to take leave? So here we find that men who score on this scale, who score highly on this scale, so that is men who really do perceive that there's not very much support for using the policies and they really feel like it's a 24/7 work culture. Those kinds of men have a much lower chance of egalitarian arrangements. So again, this is actually a large effect. So if you scored kind of a 1 on this scale, that's associated with a 75% chance of equality, whereas scoring a 5 is associated with a 40% chance of equality. Okay, so then moving on to the family and work level, the kind of couple level dynamics, here we see clearly how gendered overwork dynamics are operating. So we know from previous studies that men's overwork seems to drive couples toward more conventional arrangements at home. And it's really interesting to see how this operates here, because this is such a select sample. You'd think that a lot of these gendered expectations and residual things would be canceled out by all these other variables, but actually still here we see couples, when the man is overworking, are much less likely to have egalitarian arrangements, and that's true even when both partners are overworking. And these are pretty substantively large effects. So couples where the father only overworks have a 30% probability of equality, compared to around 70% for couples where he does not overwork. Now, I also want to note here that we actually did see a similar pattern in the men's sample. However, our stepwise regression, this is the one exception I mentioned earlier, our stepwise regressions indicated that the effect of overwork disappeared amongst the men when we included their perceptions of ideal worker norms. So this, and we checked all of the variables, like to see which one mediated it specifically. It was not any of the other variables. It was that ideal worker norm. So this suggests that at least in the male sample, the negative effect of their overwork is driven, at least in part, by the workplace culture, their perceptions of being in this culture that's driving them toward that. We were unable to assess that mechanism in the mother's sample because we were, we don't have data on their spouse's perceptions of their workplace. That's a little hard to get at in a survey. So, okay, now, okay, so not surprisingly, we also showed that in these dual career couples, women's organizational status does matter. So it is linked to fairer arrangements at home, especially for women at the higher levels of the career. So senior managers really are able to achieve that equality more readily. And then again, we see evidence here with the relative income variable. when men earn more than half of the income, the chances of equality dip below 50% or so. So it's quite striking to see all of this stuff still happening, even in this sample where we think they've got it figured out. Now, I'm not showing it here for time reasons, but we do also find a marginally significant effect of relative income in the sample for mothers. So that kind of corroborates this. There is bargaining happening, in evidence of this in both the mothers and the fathers samples. Okay. And finally, consistent with what I discussed earlier, we find that relying on family members for routine caregiving, that reduces women's odds of egalitarian arrangements. So mothers who relied on extended family have a probability, it's only about 2/3 that of those who do not rely on extended family. And I should make a point of saying too, this variable distinguished for routine care. So we were also able to look at if they had extended family for occasional or supplemental care, that that didn't have this negative effect. It was only when they were relying on the extended family as a key part of the kind of required caregiving, that we see this effect happening. Okay, and then finally, the individual level factors. So the socialization effects are really strong, and we find this in both samples. So here for the mothers, um, if they grew up, if they had a mother who was the primary caregiver during their childhood, their probability of egalitarian arrangements was only about 2/3 that of women whose parents actually shared caregiving more equally. Oh, whoops, sorry. I went back to the wrong. There we go. There we go. That's the right slide. Sorry about that. Okay, and we also see almost the same exact effect for men. So men who had a mother who was the primary caregiver also had a much lower probability of equality. Okay, and then finally, kind of shifting to these personality questions. So women who saw themselves as someone who always defends their beliefs, for instance, they had a probability of achieving equality that was about 1.6 times higher than women who said that they never defend their beliefs. And so here again, we think that this speaks to the idea that these people say they're committed, their belief is that they're committed to equality, but they're also having personality where they are perhaps are more likely to negotiate with their spouse. That's what we theorize as the mechanism. We're not able to measure negotiation, but we think that might be what's going on here. I also wanted to mention too, so we did also measure, and we don't find significance for men for defense beliefs. We weren't that surprised by that because defending your beliefs is a male typed trait anyway, and it may not be applied to negotiating for equality in the same way that it may be applied in other respects. But I'm interested to hear ideas about why that also, others' ideas about why that might be the case. And then finally, we also assessed warmth, and we thought that warmth in particular might matter even more for the fathers, because if you perceive yourself as a particularly warm, caring kind of guy, you'd think, oh, that kind of person might be especially likely to step in and work toward these caregiving uh, ideals more than men who maybe don't see it as fitting with their personality as much. We don't see any evidence for that. That variable was not significant in either model. So in general, these personality factors, I mean, the magnitude of this effect is kind of small here with the defense beliefs, but also we don't find as much evidence for personality things. But it's really cool that we're able to look at them in this larger context. Okay, so finally, I wanted to just briefly say, so we did look at housework arrangements as well. In general, a lot of our variables are not significant, don't significantly predict the probability of egalitarian housework arrangements in the same way that they do for egalitarian caregiving. However, and that kind of makes sense given that some of it is more targeted toward caregiving. So, you think about the the childcare model, et cetera. Perhaps it's really more around that. But it is interesting that it does suggest that in some ways, perhaps the equal housework arrangements might be a little more rigid, might be even more hard to change because we're identifying all these levers that we can, that seem to be acting with caregiving, but those levers aren't as operational, it seems, at least in this really select sample for the housework dimension. But here we do see again, to the extent that we do have corroborating findings, it's the ideal worker norm for the fathers. Again, that's really big. The overwork dynamics and the socialization effect does remain here. Okay, so a few key takeaways. Professional workers, they're really, to kind of summarize the way we're thinking about this is people are going to realize egalitarian ideals or desires when men are afforded more opportunities and given more permission culturally to do more at home. So that means longer paternity leaves, reasonable work hours, and family supportive workplace norms. And the norms piece there is really important. And then secondly, we also, it's going to happen more when women's jobs seem to elicit them more respect, both in their organization, society, and in their family. And when they have less physical availability to become the default caregiver, or their personality kind of ensures more opportunities for negotiating with their spouse. So that translates into higher job status, higher share of family income, working on site, and having a proactive personality. Contributions. So basically, the big one here is that we're trying to specify the constraints of this multi-level system, even for the most advantaged workers. The previous work that's really looked at organizational policies and practices has not been able to always account for the complexity of stuff that we know is happening at the family level and at the individual level. So it's important to show that these things really do matter, even when we account for other things going on, and even when we look at the most privileged workers. And the other thing that is important here is that a lot of the other research has looked at population averages. So we look on average across everyone and control for all kinds of things. But sometimes the dynamics can look really different depending on couples' place in the class structure. The second is this idea of gendered organizational ecosystems. And this I think comes through when you think about, okay, every worker in a given organization, that policy might affect that worker, but it also, whether that policy is going to be effective actually depends on whether that person's spouse or partner also has access to the kinds of policies. And it's a complicated equation. And so we really need kind of population level thinking and bigger level thinking than just thinking about individual organizations. So the main implications here are that, like I mentioned, we need collective solutions. So more focus on industry and statewide standards and practices, to establish stronger family supportive policies and norms. And this is especially important for fathers. We really have to work on how do we get rid of, the caregiving. Having children is a very normal, like typical thing that everyone, a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people would like to do, or that they do. And so it shouldn't be it's a problem for women. It should become more of the norm that, oh, actually men and women have to deal with this, and it's just part of our society and the things that all workers are dealing with. Stepping up efforts to promote more women to high status and high income positions. I mean, just that sort of like comes back full circle. We know certain practices like mentoring programs and accountability practices and all of those things in organizations that help women climb through the ranks this matters also for the division of labor. And then finally, investing in universally available and more affordable childcare, and widening the opportunity for families to have formal ways of really having reliable childcare is critical. And I think it's still challenging even for these advantaged workers. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's just fabulous.